What happens when the American dream becomes your worst nightmare? For tech billionaire Mason Sterling, he thought he had it all. A stunning Malibu mansion overlooking the Pacific, a billion-dollar company that revolutionized cloud computing, and his brilliant wife Victoria, 7 months pregnant with their first child. But beneath the glossy surface of their perfect life, a storm was brewing that would shatter everything he held dear. The late afternoon California sun painted golden streaks across the infinity pool as Victoria Sterling stood in their glass-walled living room, watching her husband pace frantically by the water's edge. Even from inside, she could see the tension radiating from his shoulders as he pressed his phone to his ear. Mason Sterling, at 38, was the charismatic CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a tech empire he'd built from a cramped garage startup into a Fortune 500 powerhouse. But to Victoria, he was simply the man who made her laugh with terrible dad jokes and held her when morning sickness left her weak and exhausted. She placed a protective hand on her swollen belly, feeling their son kick restlessly inside. The nursery was already painted in soft blues and greens, waiting for its tiny occupant. Their life was a masterpiece of American success, love, and wealth painted on a canvas of California dreams. Yet lately, hairline cracks had begun to appear in their perfect picture. The phone calls were becoming more frequent, more secretive. Mason would angle his screen away from her when texting, and generic contact names had replaced the familiar ones she used to see. Work stress, he claimed. The pressure of a major acquisition deal. Victoria tried to believe him. She'd been there from the beginning, when Sterling Dynamics was just Mason's crazy idea and a maxed-out credit card. She'd been his biggest supporter, his partner in every sense of the word. But the secrecy felt different this time. Heavier, more deliberate. Her best friend Riley Chen, a sharp-tongued divorce attorney with zero tolerance for male nonsense, had voiced her concerns over lunch last week. "Vic, I'm not saying anything's definitely going on," Riley had said carefully, stirring her iced latte. "But when a man suddenly password protects his personal laptop after 8 years of marriage, that man has secrets." Victoria had defended him, perhaps too quickly. "He's dealing with corporate espionage concerns. Riles. It's standard procedure for CEOs." Riley had just raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Right. Corporate espionage." Now, watching Mason end his call and stride toward the house, Victoria pushed those doubts away. He slid the glass door open, bringing with him the scent of chlorine and his expensive cologne. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked as he approached. He offered a tight smile, tucking his phone into his pocket. "Just work. The Morrison acquisition is hitting some snags. You know how it is." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, his lips cool against her skin. "How are you and our little soccer player doing?" "We're good," Victoria said softly. "He's been practicing his kicks. I think he's training for the World Cup." Mason chuckled, but the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's my boy." What Victoria couldn't see was the text message that had just lit up his phone screen. From Chelsea Blackwood, his vice president of operations. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Usual place. We need to discuss our future." The future Mason was too terrified to imagine, and too weak to prevent. In the gleaming 42nd floor offices of Sterling Dynamics, Chelsea Blackwood commanded attention like a force of nature. At 29, she possessed the kind of sharp, predatory beauty that made both men and women take notice. Her platinum blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her designer suits tailored to perfection, and her green eyes held an intelligence that could shift from charming to calculating in the space of a heartbeat. She'd joined Sterling Dynamics 3 years ago, rising through the ranks with a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and ruthless ambition that impressed even Mason. She could dissect a competitor's weaknesses, identify market opportunities, and close million-dollar deals with the precision of a surgeon. She was everything Mason had always admired in a business partner. And 6 months ago, during a high-stakes negotiation trip to New York, she had become something much more dangerous. Chelsea sat in her corner office, reviewing the quarterly reports, but her mind was elsewhere. The affair with Mason had started as a calculated move, a way to secure her position in the company and gain access to the inner circle of Silicon Valley power. But somewhere along the way, it had become an obsession. She wasn't just sleeping with Mason Sterling. She was studying him, learning his weaknesses, his fears, his deepest desires. And what she'd discovered was a man trapped in a marriage that had grown comfortable but passionless, weighed down by the responsibility of a baby he wasn't sure he was ready for. Chelsea had positioned herself as the solution to all his problems. She was brilliant where Victoria was merely intelligent. She was exciting where Victoria was predictable. She was free where Victoria was increasingly encumbered by pregnancy and domestic concerns. But Victoria Sterling remained the one obstacle Chelsea couldn't eliminate through conventional means. The pregnant wife with her gentle smile and trusting nature. The woman who held Mason's legal claims and social status. The woman who carried his heir. Chelsea opened her desk drawer and retrieved a small, leather-bound journal. Inside, written in her precise handwriting, was a detailed plan that would have chilled anyone who read it. Market research on natural pregnancy complications, contact information for underground chemists, detailed timelines for the gradual introduction of toxic substances. She wasn't planning to kill Victoria Sterling. That would be too obvious, too traceable. Instead, she was going to systematically destroy the woman's credibility, her health, and her hold on Mason's affections. She would make Victoria appear unstable, paranoid, and unfit to be a mother. And the beautiful irony was that Mason himself would be her unwitting accomplice. Chelsea picked up her phone and typed a carefully crafted message. I found that special herbal tea I mentioned, the one that's supposed to help with pregnancy stress and anxiety. Would you like me to pick some up for Victoria? I know how worried you've been about her lately. The response came back within minutes. That's incredibly thoughtful of you. Chelsea, yes, please. Thank you for thinking of her. Chelsea smiled as she deleted the conversation. Phase 1 of her plan was about to begin. That evening, she drove to a nondescript warehouse in the industrial district of Los Angeles. Inside, a man named Marcus Webb waited with a small, ornate tin labeled Serenity Blend Prenatal Tea. Marcus was a former pharmaceutical chemist who'd lost his license for conducting unauthorized experiments. He now made a living creating untraceable compounds for people willing to pay premium prices. The tea contained chamomile and lavender, as advertised, but it also contained carefully measured doses of glucohash extract and a synthetic compound Marcus had developed that would gradually attack the nervous system while mimicking pregnancy-related symptoms. In small doses over time, it would cause confusion, memory loss, and emotional instability. In larger doses, it would trigger premature labor. Remember, Chelsea told Marcus as she handed him a thick envelope of cash. This conversation never happened. You never saw me. This product doesn't exist. Marcus nodded and disappeared back into the shadows of his warehouse laboratory. Chelsea drove home to her luxury apartment, the tin of poison sitting innocently on her passenger seat. Tomorrow, she would present it to Mason as a thoughtful gift for his struggling wife. And Mason, desperate to help Victoria and ease his own guilt about the affair, would deliver the weapon directly into his enemy's hands. The perfect crime was about to begin, and the only fingerprints on it would belong to the man she claimed to love. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Los Angeles famous. Victoria woke in their king-sized bed, alone as usual. Mason had left early for another breakfast meeting, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and a hastily scrawled note promising to be home for dinner. She struggled to her feet, her 7-month belly making even simple movements challenging. In the bathroom mirror, she examined her reflection critically. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually glowing complexion looked pale and tired. Pregnancy was supposed to make women radiant, but lately, she felt like she was fading away. Meanwhile, at Sterling Dynamics headquarters, Chelsea was orchestrating her performance with the precision of a Broadway director. She knocked on Mason's office door, carrying the ornate tin of tea and wearing her most concerned expression. "Mason, do you have a moment?" she asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. He looked up from his computer, and she noticed the guilt that immediately flickered across his features. Their relationship had become increasingly complicated as Victoria's pregnancy progressed. The excitement of their secret affair was being overshadowed by Mason's growing anxiety about becoming a father and his deepening remorse about betraying his wife. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's on your mind?" Chelsea sat down, placing the tea tin carefully on his desk. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. about Victoria seeming stressed and overwhelmed. I remember my sister going through something similar when she was pregnant. This was a complete fabrication. Chelsea was an only child, and her sister existed only in the carefully constructed web of lies she spun around her true background. I did some research, she continued, and I found this amazing herbal tea blend. It's specifically designed for pregnant women dealing with anxiety and insomnia. All natural ingredients, completely safe for both mother and baby. Mason picked up the tin, reading the elegant script on the label. Serenity Blend Prenatal Tea. The packaging was beautiful, clearly expensive, with detailed ingredient lists and glowing testimonials. This is really thoughtful of you, Chelsea, he said, genuine gratitude in his voice. I've been so worried about her. She's been having memory problems, dizzy spells. The doctor says it's normal, but I can tell she's struggling. Pregnancy can be incredibly difficult, Chelsea said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The hormonal changes, the physical discomfort, the anxiety about becoming a parent. This tea has gotten amazing reviews from other women. They say it helps with everything from sleep quality to mood stabilization. What she didn't mention was that those reviews had been carefully purchased from a network of fake accounts she'd created specifically for this purpose. Where did you find it? Mason asked, examining the tin more closely. There's a specialty wellness shop in Santa Monica, Chelsea replied smoothly. They focus on natural remedies for women's health issues. Very exclusive, very reputable. The herbalist there personally recommended this blend for expectant mothers dealing with stress. Another lie. The shop existed, but Chelsea had never set foot inside it. She'd simply researched it online to provide authenticity to her story. Mason nodded, already mentally planning how he would present this gift to Victoria. It would be a peace offering, a way to show her that he was paying attention to her needs, that he cared about her well-being. It might even ease some of the crushing guilt he carried about his infidelity. I can't thank you enough for this, he said, standing up and coming around the desk to give Chelsea a quick, professional hug. Victoria's going to be so touched that you thought of her. As his arms briefly encircled her, Chelsea allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. The poison was now in Mason's hands, and he would deliver it himself, convinced he was performing an act of love and care. I just want to see you both happy, she said, looking up at him with carefully crafted sincerity. You deserve to have a peaceful, joyful pregnancy experience. That evening, Mason arrived home with flowers and the tin of tea, his guilt temporarily assuaged by what he believed was a thoughtful gesture. Victoria was in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner despite her increasing fatigue. Surprise, he said, presenting both gifts with a flourish. Victoria's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Oh, Mason, they're beautiful. And what's this? It's a special herbal tea, he explained, repeating Chelsea's carefully rehearsed description. Chelsea recommended it. She said it's specifically designed to help pregnant women with stress and anxiety. All natural, completely safe. For just a moment, Victoria felt a prickle of unease. Why was Mason's female colleague thinking about her pregnancy stress? But the feeling passed quickly, overwhelmed by gratitude that her husband was trying to help. That's so sweet of her, Victoria said, taking the tin and reading the label. And so thoughtful of you to remember. I've been having trouble sleeping lately. I'll brew you a cup right now, Mason offered, taking the tin and heading for the stove. As he prepared the first dose of poison, neither of them could have imagined that this simple act of apparent kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy their marriage, threaten their unborn child's life, and expose the depths of human evil hiding behind a beautiful face. Victoria sipped the fragrant tea, noting its pleasant herbal flavor, completely unaware that she was drinking the first installment of her own systematic destruction. The effects of Chelsea's poison weren't immediate, which made them all the more insidious. Victoria began drinking the tea nightly, as Mason brought her a steaming cup before bed with the dedication of a loving husband. The ritual became a sweet moment of connection between them, one of the few times each day when Mason's attention was fully focused on her rather than his phone or his work. For the first week, Victoria actually felt better. The placebo effect of believing she was drinking something beneficial, combined with Mason's increased attention, lifted her spirits. She slept more deeply and woke feeling refreshed. The tea seemed to be working exactly as Chelsea had promised. But by the second week, subtle changes began to emerge. Victoria found herself struggling to remember simple things. She would walk into a room and forget why she'd come. She would start sentences and lose track of her thoughts halfway through. When she mentioned these symptoms to Mason, he offered reassuring explanations. "It's pregnancy brain, honey," he said, stroking her hair as they lay in bed. "Dr. Martinez told us that was completely normal. The hormones affect memory and concentration." Victoria wanted to believe him, but the symptoms felt different from the mild forgetfulness she'd experienced earlier in her pregnancy. This was more like a fog rolling over her mind, making everything feel distant and unclear. The third week brought physical symptoms. Victoria began experiencing dizzy spells that would leave her gripping door frames and walls for support. Her coordination seemed off, and she would sometimes stumble over nothing. The fatigue that had been manageable before became overwhelming, leaving her exhausted even after a full night's sleep. During this time, Chelsea was carefully monitoring her progress through Mason's reports. He would mention Victoria's symptoms during their lunch meetings, expressing concern and asking for advice. Chelsea would respond with perfectly calibrated worry and helpful suggestions. "Maybe she should cut back on her activities," Chelsea suggested one afternoon as they sat in an upscale restaurant downtown. "Pregnancy can be overwhelming, especially for high-achieving women who are used to being in control. Sometimes the body forces you to slow down." "She's already cut back," Mason said, rubbing his temples. "She resigned from the hospital fundraising committee last week. Said she couldn't handle the responsibility anymore." This was music to Chelsea's ears. Victoria's gradual withdrawal from social and professional activities would make it easier to isolate her and undermine her credibility when the time came to make more serious accusations about her mental state. The fourth week brought the crisis Chelsea had been waiting for. Victoria was scheduled to give a presentation to the board of the children's charity she'd founded 3 years earlier. It was an organization close to her heart, focused on providing educational resources to underprivileged youth. She'd built it from nothing into a respected nonprofit that had helped thousands of children. Victoria had prepared extensively for the presentation, but as she stood before the 12 board members in the elegant conference room, her mind went completely blank. She stared at her notes, but the words seemed to swim on the page. She tried to speak, but the thoughts wouldn't connect. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. I seem to have lost my place." Board Chair Margaret Hamilton, a stern woman in her 60s who'd always been somewhat skeptical of Victoria's young age and wealth, watched with undisguised disapproval. "Perhaps you'd like to take a moment to collect yourself, Mrs. Sterling." Victoria tried again, but the fog in her mind only grew thicker. She couldn't remember the statistics she'd memorized, couldn't recall the success stories she'd planned to share. The room began to spin slightly, and she gripped the podium for support. "I think," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I need to reschedule this meeting. I'm not feeling well." The murmurs that followed her as she left the room were devastating. Victoria Sterling, once known for her sharp mind and passionate advocacy, had appeared confused, unprepared, and unstable. Word spread quickly through Los Angeles's tight-knit charity circles. By the next day, 2 major donors had called to express concerns about the organization's leadership. That evening, Victoria lay on their bed, staring at the ceiling and fighting back tears of humiliation and confusion. When Mason arrived home from work, he found her in this state of despair. "I heard about the board meeting," he said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Margaret Hamilton called to check on you." Victoria's stomach clenched with fresh shame. "What did she say?" "She's concerned," Mason replied carefully. "She thinks maybe you're taking on too much stress right now. Maybe it would be better to step back from the charity work until after the baby comes." This was exactly what Chelsea had coached him to say. The systematic removal of Victoria's independence and identity was proceeding perfectly according to plan. "I built that organization," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "It's my life's work. And it'll still be there after the baby's born," Mason said, taking her hand. "Right now, you need to focus on your health, our son's health." He reached for the ornate tin on her nightstand. "Let me make you some tea. It'll help you relax." As Victoria drank the nightly dose of poison, she felt herself disappearing a little more. The confident, capable woman she'd been was dissolving, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. Someone weak, confused, and utterly dependent on others for the most basic decisions. And in her luxury apartment across town, Chelsea Blackwood opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate another victory in her war for Mason Sterling's future. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been Victoria's obstetrician for 3 years, guiding her through two heartbreaking miscarriages before this successful pregnancy. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and gentle hands, someone Victoria trusted completely, which made her betrayal all the more devastating. Chelsea had approached Dr. Martinez's office 3 months earlier, not as a patient, but as a concerned colleague of Victoria's husband. She'd presented herself as Mason's vice president, worried about the stress Victoria was experiencing and wondering if there was anything the company's health insurance could do to provide additional support. During that meeting, Chelsea had also made the acquaintance of Tommy Rodriguez, a lab technician who processed blood work and urine samples. Tommy was drowning in student loan debt, struggling to support his elderly mother, and vulnerable to the kind of financial temptation Chelsea specialized in exploiting. For $5,000 a month, Tommy agreed to alter Victoria's test results. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would endanger the baby, just small adjustments that would make her blood work appear normal even when it wasn't. Chelsea had convinced him it was for Victoria's own good, to prevent unnecessary anxiety during a high-risk pregnancy. So when Victoria arrived for her routine checkup in the 5th week of drinking the poison tea, her blood showed dangerous levels of toxins, but the report Dr. Martinez received showed perfect health. "Everything looks wonderful," Dr. Martinez announced, reviewing the falsified results. "Your blood pressure is excellent, your glucose levels are perfect, and all your vitamins and minerals are in the ideal range." Victoria felt a flood of relief wash over her. "But what about the memory problems? The dizziness, I feel like I'm losing my mind sometimes." Dr. Martinez smiled reassuringly. "Pregnancy brain is incredibly common, especially in the 3rd trimester. Your body is channeling all its resources to your growing baby. Some cognitive changes are perfectly normal." "But it's getting worse," Victoria insisted. "Yesterday I forgot my own phone number when someone asked for it. I've had the same number for 8 years. Hormones can do remarkable things to our brains," Dr. Martinez explained patiently. "I've had patients who temporarily forgot how to drive to places they'd been going for years. It sounds scary, but it's just your brain prioritizing different functions right now." Victoria wanted to believe her doctor, but something felt fundamentally wrong. She'd researched pregnancy symptoms extensively, and what she was experiencing seemed beyond the normal range. But Dr. Martinez was the expert, and the test results were apparently normal. "Is there anything I can do?" Victoria asked desperately. "Keep doing what you're doing," Dr. Martinez advised. "Rest, stay hydrated, take your prenatal vitamins, and try to minimize stress. I heard you're drinking herbal tea to help with relaxation. That's excellent. Natural remedies are often the best approach." If Dr. Martinez had seen Victoria's real test results, she would have immediately hospitalized her and begun emergency treatment for heavy metal poisoning. But thanks to Tommy's alterations, she saw only perfect health in a woman who was slowly being killed. Victoria left the doctor's office feeling simultaneously relieved and confused. The medical professional had assured her everything was fine, but her body was telling her otherwise. She decided to trust the science over her instincts, a decision that would nearly cost her everything. That evening, she called Riley to share the good news. "Dr. Martinez says all my tests came back perfect. I guess I was just being paranoid." Riley, who had been growing increasingly concerned about her best friend's deteriorating condition, wasn't entirely convinced. "That's great, Vic, but how are you feeling? You sounded really shaky when we talked yesterday." "I'm still having some issues," Victoria admitted, "but the doctor says it's normal pregnancy brain. I just need to rest more and not worry so much." "Maybe you should get a second opinion," Riley suggested carefully. "From who? Dr. Martinez has been my doctor for years. She delivered Jenny's baby and Sarah's twins. She's one of the best OBs in the city." Riley couldn't argue with that logic, but something still felt wrong. Victoria had always been sharp, organized, and articulate. The woman she'd had lunch with last week had been confused. forgetful, and seemed to struggle with basic conversations. After they hung up, Riley sat in her home office, staring at her phone. She'd built a successful legal career by trusting her instincts, and her instincts were screaming that Victoria was in danger. But danger from what and from whom? She opened her laptop and began researching symptoms of pregnancy-related cognitive changes. What she found was concerning. While some memory issues were indeed normal, the severity of Victoria's symptoms seemed extreme. The combination of memory loss, confusion, dizziness, and coordination problems pointed to something more serious than hormonal fluctuations. On impulse, she called her cousin Marcus, who worked as a toxicologist for the LAPD. "Mark, I need to ask you something hypothetically. If someone were being slowly poisoned, what would that look like?" "That's a cheerful topic for a Thursday evening," Marcus replied. "Why do you ask it? Just curious. For a case I'm working on." Marcus considered the question. "Depends on the poison, but classic signs would include cognitive impairment, memory loss, coordination problems, fatigue, and digestive issues. The symptoms would typically worsen gradually over time." Riley felt her stomach drop. "How would someone get poisoned slowly, like over months?" "Usually through something they consume regularly: food, water, medication, or supplements. The poisoner would want something the victim trusts and consumes willingly." After ending the call, Riley sat in the growing darkness of her office, pieces of a horrible puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Victoria's symptoms had started around the time Mason began bringing her the nightly tea, the same tea that he'd gotten from his female colleague at work. Riley picked up her phone to call Victoria, then hesitated. She needed more proof before making such a serious accusation. But she also knew that if she was right, every day of delay could put both Victoria and the baby in greater danger. She made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would hire a private investigator to look into Chelsea Blackwood, and she would do it without telling Victoria or Mason. Because sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who betray us the deepest. Frank Martinez had been a private investigator for 15 years, specializing in corporate fraud and infidelity cases. At 52, he'd seen the worst of human nature disguised as respectability. But when Riley Chen called him about Chelsea Blackwood, he had no idea he was about to uncover one of the most calculated schemes of his career. Riley met him at a coffee shop in Santa Monica, away from her usual haunts in Beverly Hills. She'd chosen Frank based on his reputation for discretion and his background in computer forensics. What she needed was information, not confrontation. "I want you to investigate someone," Riley said without preamble, sliding a file across the table. "Chelsea Blackwood, Vice President of Operations at Sterling Dynamics. I think she might be involved in something that's hurting my best friend." Frank opened the file, reviewing the basic information Riley had compiled. "What kind of hurt are we talking about? Potentially poisoning," Riley said quietly. "My friend Victoria Sterling has been experiencing severe cognitive and physical symptoms since she started drinking herbal tea that came from Chelsea Blackwood." Frank's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation. What makes you think it's intentional?" Riley explained Victoria's deteriorating condition, the timing of the symptoms with the introduction of the tea, and her growing suspicions about Mason's relationship with Chelsea. "I need to know who she really is, what her background looks like, and if there's any evidence of prior suspicious behavior." Frank nodded, making notes. "I'll start with a comprehensive background check, financial records, and digital forensics. If she's done this before, there'll be traces. How long will it take?" "Give me a week for the initial report. If I find something concerning, I'll call you immediately." Frank's investigation began with public records, social media analysis, and professional background verification. What he found in the first 24 hours was troubling enough to accelerate his timeline. Chelsea Blackwood's history was too clean, too perfect. Her educational credentials checked out, but there were gaps in her employment history that didn't make sense. More concerning was what he found when he dug deeper into her personal relationships. In the past 8 years, Chelsea had been involved with 3 men, all of whom were wealthy, all of whom were married, and all of whom had experienced significant life changes after their relationships with her ended. One had divorced his wife under mysterious circumstances involving accusations of infidelity that were never proven. Another had suffered a nervous breakdown and been hospitalized for psychiatric treatment. The third had died in what was ruled an accidental overdose of prescription medication. Frank called Riley on Thursday afternoon. "We need to meet tonight." They met at Riley's office after hours, the building empty and secure. Frank spread photographs and documents across her conference table like a detective presenting evidence at a murder trial. "Chelsea Blackwood isn't who she claims to be," Frank began. "Her real name is Chelsea Webb. She's originally from Portland, Oregon, and she has a juvenile record that was sealed but not destroyed." He pointed to a grainy photograph of a teenage girl with dark hair and cold eyes. At 16, she was suspected of poisoning her stepfather with antifreeze mixed into his daily protein shakes. He survived, but suffered permanent kidney damage. She was never charged because they couldn't prove intent, and her mother insisted it was an accident. Riley felt sick. "What else? She's done this before. 3 times that I can prove, possibly more. She targets wealthy married men, initiates affairs, then systematically destroys their marriages through elaborate schemes." The husband of her first victim was a real estate developer in Seattle. His wife started experiencing mysterious health problems, became convinced she was losing her mind, and eventually committed suicide. Frank pulled out another document. The second victim was the wife of a pharmaceutical executive in Phoenix. She suffered what appeared to be a psychotic break during pregnancy and was institutionalized. She lost custody of her children and her husband divorced her while she was still in treatment. 6 months later, he married Chelsea. And the third, Denver oil executive. His wife died of what was ruled an accidental overdose, but the timeline is suspicious. She'd been experiencing cognitive problems for months before her death, and there were traces of industrial chemicals in her system that were never explained. Riley stared at the photographs of 3 women, all beautiful, all wealthy, all destroyed by the same predator who was now targeting her best friend. "How does she get away with it?" "She's patient and she's smart," Frank explained. "She spends months or even years ingratiating herself with the husband, learning his weaknesses, positioning herself as the perfect alternative to his troubled wife. By the time the wife is dead or institutionalized, she's already secured her place as the grieving widower's support system." "We have to stop her. It's not that simple," Frank warned. "Everything I've found is circumstantial. She's never been convicted of anything, and the pattern only becomes clear when you look at all the cases together. Individual law enforcement agencies never made the connections." Frank opened his laptop and showed Riley surveillance footage he'd obtained from a parking garage. "But I've been watching her this week, and she's definitely up to something. Yesterday, she met with a man named Tommy Rodriguez, who works at the medical lab that processes Victoria's blood work. They had what looked like a financial transaction." Riley's blood ran cold. "She's been tampering with the test results?" "It gets worse." Frank pulled up another video file. "This morning, she visited a warehouse in the industrial district. I followed her inside and recorded this." The footage showed Chelsea speaking with a man in a makeshift laboratory, exchanging money for small packages. Frank had enhanced the audio enough to catch fragments of their conversation, including references to increasing the dosage and triggering premature labor. "We have to call the police," Riley said. "With what evidence, grainy surveillance footage, and a pattern of suspicious deaths that were never ruled homicides, we need something concrete, something that directly links her to Victoria's poisoning." Riley stood up, pacing the length of her office. "Then we get it." "How?" Frank smiled grimly. "We set a trap, but it's going to be dangerous, and Victoria's going to have to be the bait." As they began planning their strategy, neither of them knew that across town, Chelsea was preparing to accelerate her timeline. Victoria's symptoms were progressing exactly as planned, but Mason was showing signs of wanting to seek additional medical opinions. It was time for the next phase of her scheme. Time to convince everyone that Victoria Sterling was having a complete mental breakdown. The call came at 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday, jarring Riley from deep sleep. Victoria's voice on the other end was barely recognizable, high-pitched and panicked. "Riley, you have to help me," Victoria whispered urgently. "I think someone's been in my house. Things are moved around, different from how I left them. Mason says I'm imagining it, but I know someone was here." Riley sat up, instantly alert. "Vic, Where's Mason? Sleeping. He took one of his pills. He's been taking them a lot lately. Victoria's voice dropped even lower. Riley, I think I'm losing my mind. I can't remember conversations I had yesterday. I found notes in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing. What's happening to me? This was exactly what Frank had warned her about. The final phase of Chelsea's plan would involve making Victoria appear mentally unstable, creating a paper trail of erratic behavior that would justify more extreme measures. I'm coming over, Riley said, already reaching for her clothes. No! Victoria's voice was sharp with panic. Mason will be angry if he finds out I called you. He says I need to handle my anxiety internally, that I'm becoming too dependent on other people to validate my feelings. Riley recognized the language of psychological manipulation. Someone was systematically undermining Victoria's confidence in her own perceptions, a classic technique used by abusers to control their victims. Victoria, listen to me very carefully, Riley said. I need you to stop drinking that tea. Right now. Tonight. Don't let Mason make you another cup. But it's the only thing that helps me sleep. Please, trust me. Just for one night, skip the tea, and tomorrow, I want you to come to my office. There's something I need to show you. But Riley wouldn't get the chance. The next morning, Victoria woke up feeling clearer than she had in weeks. For the first time in months, her mind felt sharp, her thoughts organized. She remembered her conversation with Riley clearly, and the absence of her usual morning fog confirmed her best friend's suspicions. The tea was poisoning her. Victoria's moment of clarity was short-lived. As she stood in her kitchen, staring at the innocent-looking tin on the counter, Mason appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work. You look better this morning, he observed, though his tone suggested this wasn't entirely good news. I feel better. I skipped the tea last night. Mason's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Why would you do that, Doctor? Martinez said the tea was helping with your anxiety levels. Actually, I think it might be making me worse. Victoria, Mason's voice took on the patient, condescending tone she'd grown to dread. We've talked about this. You're looking for external causes for problems that are internal. The paranoia, the conspiracy theories, the refusal to trust medical professionals. These are all signs that you need help. Before Victoria could respond, Mason pulled out his phone and made a call. Dr. Reeves, this is Mason Sterling. I think we need to accelerate our timeline. Yes, this morning if possible. Victoria felt ice water flooding her veins. Who is Dr. Reeves? What timeline? Mason ended the call and looked at her with what appeared to be genuine sadness. Dr. Reeves is a psychiatrist who specializes in pregnancy-related psychological disorders. I consulted with him last week about your symptoms. You consulted with a psychiatrist about me without telling me. You've been exhibiting signs of paranoid delusions. Victoria, last night's phone call to Riley, accusing me of drugging you, claiming someone broke into our house. Dr. Reeves thinks you might be developing postpartum psychosis early. The room began to spin, but this time it wasn't from the poison. It was from the realization that her husband, the man she'd loved and trusted for 8 years, was participating in her systematic destruction. I want to call Riley, Victoria said, reaching for her phone. Mason gently took the phone from her hands. Riley isn't qualified to help with this kind of crisis. She's an attorney, not a medical professional. And honestly, she's been enabling your paranoid thoughts instead of encouraging you to seek proper treatment. Within an hour, 2 men arrived at the house. They wore uniforms that looked medical but weren't quite official. They spoke in calm, professional voices as they explained that Victoria needed to come with them for a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. This is for your own safety, one of them explained, and for the safety of your unborn child. Dr. Reeves is concerned that your current mental state could pose a risk to the pregnancy. Victoria looked at Mason, searching his face for any sign of the man she'd married. You're having me committed. I'm getting you help, he said firmly. I love you too much to watch you deteriorate like this. As they led her from the house, Victoria caught sight of a black sedan parked across the street. Behind the wheel sat a blonde woman in designer sunglasses, watching the proceedings with visible satisfaction. Chelsea Blackwood had orchestrated the perfect crime. While Victoria was locked away in a psychiatric facility, Undergoing evaluation for mental illness, she didn't have. Chelsea would move into the Sterling mansion to help Mason through this difficult time. She would comfort him, support him, and position herself as his rock during the crisis. And if Victoria somehow convinced the doctor she was sane, if she somehow exposed the poisoning plot, it would only make her appear more delusional. After all, who would believe that a respected business executive would orchestrate such an elaborate scheme? The psychiatric facility was clean, modern, and utterly terrifying. Victoria was placed in a room with no sharp objects, no glass, and a window that didn't open. She was given medication that made her thoughts fuzzy and her movements sluggish. When she tried to explain to Dr. Reeves about the poisoned tea, about Chelsea's manipulation of Mason, about the systematic destruction of her life, her words sounded crazy even to her own ears. These elaborate conspiracy theories are a common symptom. Dr. Reeves explained to Mason during a consultation Victoria wasn't allowed to attend. Patients create complex narratives to explain their symptoms, often involving the people closest to them. It's a way of externalizing internal psychological conflicts. For 72 hours, Victoria was trapped in a nightmare where her reality was dismissed as delusion, where her desperate attempts to communicate the truth were seen as further evidence of her mental illness. But on the evening of her second day, a nurse she'd never seen before slipped her a note during medication rounds. It was from Riley, written on legal letterhead, "I know the truth about Chelsea. Help is coming. Stay strong." Victoria palmed the note, her heart racing with the first hope she'd felt in days. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't alone. And somewhere outside these sterile walls, the truth was finally being assembled. But she didn't know that Chelsea's plan had one final, devastating act. And this time, the target wasn't just Victoria's sanity. It was her unborn child's life. While Victoria was imprisoned in the psychiatric facility, Chelsea moved through the Sterling mansion like a conquering queen, claiming her territory. She hung her clothes in the master bedroom closet, placed her photos on the nightstand, and rearranged the furniture to suit her taste. The nursery, painted in soft blues and filled with Victoria's carefully chosen furniture, became her particular focus. "Maybe we should redecorate," she suggested to Mason as they stood in the doorway. Her arm linked through his. "Start fresh. New color scheme. New furniture. It might be better for everyone's mental health." Mason nodded absently. The past 3 days had been a blur of meetings with psychiatrists, consultations with family lawyers, and increasingly complicated arrangements for Victoria's treatment. Dr. Reeves had suggested that Victoria's condition was more serious than initially thought, requiring potentially months of intensive therapy. "I don't know what I would have done without you these past few days," Mason told Chelsea, pulling her closer. "You've been incredible," Chelsea smiled, pressing herself against him. "This is where I belong, Mason. Taking care of you, supporting your dreams. We're a team." What Mason didn't know was that Chelsea had been making her own preparations. The psychiatric commitment had bought her time, but she needed something more permanent, something that would eliminate Victoria as a threat forever. That evening, as Mason attended another consultation with Dr. Reeves, Chelsea returned to the industrial warehouse where Marcus Webb had his illegal laboratory. This time, she carried a substantial briefcase full of cash. "I need something stronger," she told Marcus without preamble. "Something that will cause immediate, dramatic symptoms, preferably something that mimics a natural medical emergency." Marcus looked uncomfortable. "What we've been using is already pretty potent. If you increase the dosage much more, you're talking about potentially fatal consequences." "Not fatal," Chelsea corrected, "but serious enough to require emergency medical intervention. I need her to have a medical crisis that can't be dismissed as psychological." "Why?" Chelsea's eyes went cold. "Because she's starting to convince people she's not crazy. I need something that will put her back in the hospital, under medical supervision, where she can't cause problems." Marcus mixed a new compound, this one designed to cause severe uterine contractions and respiratory distress. In a pregnant woman, it would simulate the onset of premature labor while also creating symptoms that could be attributed to psychological stress. "1 dose," Marcus warned as he handed her the small vial. "Any more than this, and you could kill both mother and child. 1 dose is all I need." Chelsea returned to the Sterling mansion and waited. Victoria was scheduled to be released from psychiatric hold the next afternoon, and Chelsea knew she would be desperate to prove her sanity. The perfect opportunity would come when Victoria insisted on having that final cup of tea, trying to demonstrate that she'd been wrong about it being poisoned. But Riley Chen and Frank Martinez had other plans. Riley had spent the 72 hours of Victoria's commitment assembling a legal case that would not only free her best friend, but destroy Chelsea's credibility permanently. Frank's surveillance had captured Chelsea's meetings with Marcus, and they'd obtained samples of the original tea that tested positive for multiple toxic substances. More importantly, they'd convinced Tommy Rodriguez to cooperate with authorities. Faced with evidence of his participation in medical fraud and the potential for accessory to attempted murder charges, Tommy had agreed to provide testimony about Chelsea's payments and instructions to alter Victoria's test results. On the morning Victoria was scheduled for release, Riley arrived at the psychiatric facility with a court order, a team of FBI agents, and enough evidence to charge Chelsea Blackwood with attempted murder. But they were almost too late. Victoria, determined to prove she wasn't suffering from paranoid delusions, had insisted on returning home immediately after her release. Despite Riley's frantic phone calls and attempts to intercept her, Victoria had taken a taxi directly to the mansion, where she'd found Chelsea playing the role of concerned caregiver. "Victoria, you look so much better," Chelsea said with perfectly performed relief. "Mason's been worried sick. He's in meetings all day, but he asked me to stay and make sure you were comfortable." Victoria studied the woman who had destroyed her life, noting details she'd missed before. The way Chelsea's eyes didn't match her smile, the possessive way she moved through Victoria's home, the subtle changes to the decor that claimed the space as her own. "I want to apologize," Victoria said carefully. "I know I've been saying some pretty crazy things lately. About the tea, about you, about Mason. I think the stress of the pregnancy just got to me." Chelsea's smile widened, genuine this time. "That's completely understandable. Pregnancy can do wild things to our minds. The important thing is that you're getting better. I was hoping," Victoria continued, "that maybe we could start over. Maybe you could make me one of those cups of tea. I think I was wrong about it making me feel worse. Actually, I think it was helping, and stopping it might have triggered the mental health crisis." This was exactly what Chelsea had hoped to hear. Victoria was offering to drink the poison voluntarily, making it impossible for anyone to claim she'd been forced or coerced. "Of course," Chelsea said warmly. "I'll make it extra strong. You need all the calming effects you can get after such a traumatic few days." As Chelsea prepared the tea in the kitchen, adding the contents of Marcus's vial to the mixture, Victoria quietly activated the recording app on her phone. Riley had coached her extensively on what to say, how to get Chelsea to reveal her true intentions. "You know," Victoria called out, "I've been thinking about what Dr. Reeves said, about how paranoid thoughts can seem so real to the person having them. I was so convinced that someone was trying to hurt me." Chelsea returned with the steaming mug, her expression sympathetic. "Delusions can be incredibly powerful. I'm sure it felt completely real to you." Victoria accepted the tea, noting its bitter smell. "I kept thinking that if someone really wanted to hurt me, they'd have to be incredibly smart about it. They'd have to find a way to make me complicit in my own destruction." "That's a very insightful observation," Chelsea said, sitting down across from Victoria. "It shows how much clearer your thinking has become." Victoria lifted the mug toward her lips, then paused. "The perfect crime would be one where the victim delivers the poison to herself, wouldn't it?" Chelsea's smile faltered slightly. "I suppose so. Why do you ask?" "Just thinking about how clever some people can be," Victoria said. "How they can manipulate situations, manipulate people, to get exactly what they want." Instead of drinking the tea, Victoria set the mug down on the coffee table. "The thing is, Chelsea, I remember now. Everything. The memory loss was temporary, just like the other symptoms. And I remember things about you that I hadn't put together before." Chelsea's mask began to slip. "I don't know what you're talking about. I remember researching your background when Mason first hired you. There were gaps in your employment history, references that were difficult to verify. And I remember thinking at the time that it was odd for someone so accomplished to have such an unclear professional timeline." "Victoria, you're starting to sound paranoid again." "I also remember the wives," Victoria continued, her voice steady and strong. The three women who died or disappeared after being involved with men you worked with. Sarah Morrison in Seattle, Janet Phillips in Phoenix, Linda Carter in Denver. Chelsea stood up abruptly, her composure completely shattered. You have no idea what you're talking about. Actually, I do, Victoria smiled, holding up her phone. I have a very clear idea, and everything you've said in the last 10 minutes has been recorded. At that moment, the front door burst open, and Riley entered with FBI agents and local police. Chelsea spun around, trapped between Victoria's recording device and law enforcement officers. Chelsea Webb, Agent Martinez announced, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and federal charges related to mail fraud and interstate criminal activity. As they read Chelsea her rights, Victoria stood on shaking legs and walked to the window. Outside, she could see Mason's car pulling into the driveway. In a few minutes, her husband would learn that the woman he'd trusted, the woman he'd allowed to destroy his wife's life, was a serial killer who had been using him as her unwitting accomplice. The perfect crime had been perfectly solved, but the damage to Victoria's marriage, her trust, and her sense of safety would take much longer to heal. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with news crews lining the hallway and reporters broadcasting live from the courthouse steps. The case of People versus Chelsea Webb had captured national attention, not just because of the shocking nature of her crimes, but because of the methodical way she had manipulated successful, intelligent people into participating in their own destruction. Victoria sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, her hands resting on her now 8-month pregnant belly. The baby had survived Chelsea's poisoning, but Dr. Martinez had warned that there might be long-term developmental effects they wouldn't discover for months or years. Every kick, every movement Victoria felt was both a blessing and a reminder of how close they'd come to tragedy. Mason sat several rows behind her, separated by more than just physical distance. He'd moved out of the mansion the day after Chelsea's arrest, unable to face the home where he'd unknowingly delivered poison to his pregnant wife night after night. His testimony would be crucial to the prosecution's case, but it would also be a public confession of his adultery and negligence. The prosecutor, District Attorney Sarah Kim, had built her case methodically, presenting evidence that painted a picture of calculated evil. She began with Chelsea's real background, the sealed juvenile records that showed a pattern of violence dating back to her teenage years. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, D.A. Kim said in her opening statement, what you're about to hear isn't just the story of one crime, but of a predator who has spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of psychological manipulation and murder. The first week of testimony focused on Chelsea's previous victims. Sarah Morrison's sister testified about the gradual deterioration of her health, the strange symptoms that doctors couldn't explain, and the devastating loss of a vibrant young woman who'd had everything to live for. Janet Phillips' mother, now caring for the grandchildren her daughter had lost custody of, wept as she described the psychiatric facility where Janet remained institutionalized, still believing she was losing her mind. But it was Linda Carter's teenage daughter who provided the most powerful testimony. Now 19, she'd spent the last 3 years investigating her mother's death, convinced it hadn't been the accident authorities had ruled it to be. My mom started getting sick about 6 months after Chelsea Webb started working for my dad's company, she testified, her voice clear and strong. She would forget things, get confused, have dizzy spells. My dad took her to doctor after doctor, but they all said her tests were normal. The night she died, she called me crying, saying she felt like she was going crazy. She said someone was trying to hurt her, but everyone thought she was being paranoid. Chelsea's defense attorney, a high-priced lawyer named Robert Kane, tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, a woman whose relationships with troubled, wealthy men had been twisted into a criminal conspiracy by overzealous prosecutors. But the evidence was overwhelming. Frank Martinez testified about his surveillance, presenting video footage of Chelsea's meetings with Marcus Webb and Tommy Rodriguez. The FBI's forensic accountant traced financial payments from Chelsea's accounts to both men, creating an undeniable paper trail of conspiracy. Dr. Martinez, Victoria's obstetrician, took the stand with tears in her eyes. I trusted my lab results completely, she testified. I never imagined that someone could be systematically falsifying medical tests. If I had seen Mrs. Sterling's real blood work, I would have hospitalized her immediately and begun emergency treatment for poisoning. Tommy Rodriguez, testifying under a plea agreement, described in detail how Chelsea had approached him with what seemed like a humanitarian request. She said Mrs. Sterling was already anxious about her pregnancy and that seeing slightly abnormal test results might cause unnecessary stress that could harm the baby. She convinced me I was helping protect both mother and child. Marcus Webb, facing his own criminal charges, provided the most damning testimony. He described not only the compounds he'd created for Chelsea, but her coldly professional approach to ordering them. She knew exactly what symptoms she wanted to create and how long she wanted them to take to develop. She had researched everything in advance. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a business transaction. When Victoria took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Dressed in a simple blue maternity dress, she spoke with quiet dignity about the gradual erosion of her identity, her health, and her sanity. The cruelest part, she testified, wasn't the physical symptoms. It was losing faith in my own perceptions, my own mind. When you can't trust your own thoughts, when everyone around you is telling you that what you're experiencing isn't real, you begin to disappear as a person. Kim guided Victoria through the timeline of her poisoning, from the first cup of tea to her psychiatric commitment. Mrs. Sterling, how did it feel to discover that your husband had been the one delivering the poison that was making you sick? Victoria paused, her hand moving to her belly. It felt like losing everything twice. First, I lost myself to the poison. Then I lost my ability to trust the person I loved most in the world. Chelsea's cross-examination was brutal. Defense attorney Kane suggested that Victoria's symptoms had been psychosomatic, brought on by the stress of her husband's infidelity. He implied that she had created the poisoning narrative to avoid facing the reality of her failing marriage. Isn't it true, Mrs. Sterling, that you suspected your husband was having an affair months before you claimed to start experiencing symptoms? Yes, Victoria admitted. And isn't it possible that your physical symptoms were actually manifestations of emotional distress? No, Victoria said firmly. Because the symptoms stopped completely when I stopped drinking the tea, and they returned when I resumed drinking it during the controlled tests the FBI conducted. This was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence. Under medical supervision, Victoria had agreed to consume small amounts of the tea while hospitalized, so doctors could observe its effects. Within hours, she'd experienced the same cognitive impairment and physical symptoms that had plagued her for months. Mason's testimony was perhaps the most difficult to watch. He took the stand looking like a man who had aged years in the past few months, his usual confidence replaced by shame and remorse. I love my wife, he said, his voice barely audible. I never wanted to hurt her, but I allowed myself to be manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit my weaknesses and my guilt. Hunnam, D.A. Kim walked him through his relationship with Chelsea, the affair, and his gradual acceptance of her suggestions about Victoria's mental state. Mr. Sterling, did you ever suspect that the tea Ms. Webb had recommended might be causing your wife's symptoms? No, Mason replied. Chelsea positioned herself as someone who cared about Victoria's well-being. She would express concern about Victoria's condition, suggest that I was being too patient with what she called obvious psychological problems. She made me feel like I was enabling Victoria's illness by not insisting on psychiatric treatment. Did you love Miss Webb? Mason looked across the courtroom at Chelsea, who stared back at him with undisguised hatred. I thought I did, but what I felt wasn't love. It was manipulation disguised as love. She studied me, learned what I needed to hear, and provided it precisely when I was most vulnerable. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Chelsea after her arrest. Dr. Reynolds testified that Chelsea showed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, with a particularly sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Ms. Webb demonstrates an unusual combination of high intelligence, complete lack of empathy, and exceptional skill at reading and exploiting human weaknesses, Dr. Reynolds testified. In my professional opinion, she represents an ongoing danger to society and is extremely unlikely to respond to rehabilitation. Chelsea's defense lasted only 2 days. Kane called character witnesses who testified to her professional accomplishments in charitable work, trying to paint her as someone who couldn't possibly be capable of such calculated evil. But when Chelsea herself took the stand, her true nature became impossible to hide. Under direct examination, she maintained her innocence, claiming to be the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by Victoria and Riley to destroy her career and personal life. But under cross-examination, cracks in her facade became chasms. Ms. Webb, DeKim asked, why did you research herbal abortifacients and untraceable pregnancy toxins on your work computer? I was researching natural remedies that might help Victoria with her obvious psychological problems. And why did you pay Marcus Webb $5,000 for a compound designed to cause uterine contractions and respiratory distress? I never paid anyone anything for any compounds. D.A. Kim presented bank records, surveillance footage, and recorded phone conversations that contradicted every one of Chelsea's denials. With each piece of evidence, Chelsea became more agitated, her careful composure cracking to reveal the cold rage underneath. The moment that sealed her fate came when D.A. Kim asked about her previous relationships. Ms. Webb, isn't it true that 3 women associated with your former romantic partners died under suspicious circumstances? Chelsea's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the question. Chelsea's response was chilling in its honesty. Those women were weak, she said, her voice flat and emotionless. They were holding back men who could have been great. I simply removed obstacles. The courtroom gasped. Even her own attorney looked shocked by the admission. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood and delivered the verdict that would ensure Chelsea Webb would never hurt another family. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On all federal charges related to mail fraud and interstate criminal activity, we find the defendant guilty. Chelsea showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Victoria felt something inside her chest finally unclench. Justice wasn't healing, but it was a beginning. 6 months after Chelsea Webb was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Victoria Sterling gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Riley Mason Sterling, honoring both the friend who had saved her life and the man who, despite everything, remained his father. The delivery room was filled with cautious joy. Dr. Martinez monitored every moment carefully, watching for any signs of the developmental problems that could have resulted from Victoria's poisoning. But as Riley Mason took his first breath and let out a strong, clear cry, the fears that had haunted Victoria throughout her pregnancy began to fade. He's perfect, Dr. Martinez announced, placing the baby on Victoria's chest. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that clearly work beautifully. Victoria looked down at her son, this small miracle who had survived everything Chelsea had tried to do to him. His eyes, when they opened briefly, were the same deep blue as Mason's. His tiny fist curled around her finger with surprising strength. Riley Chen stood beside the hospital bed, tears streaming down her face. She'd been Victoria's advocate, protector, and constant companion throughout the trial and the final months of pregnancy. The friendship that had always been strong had been forged into something unbreakable by the crisis they'd survived together. He's beautiful, Vic, Riley whispered. And he's safe. That's all that matters now. Mason stood awkwardly near the window, uncertain of his place in this tableau of new life and fresh beginnings. The past year had destroyed their marriage, but it had also forced him to confront the man he'd become and the man he wanted to be. He'd resigned from Sterling Dynamics, sold the company to focus on rebuilding his relationship with his son and, if possible, earning back some measure of Victoria's trust. "Can I hold him?" Mason asked quietly. Victoria looked up at him, seeing not the man who had betrayed her, but the father of her child. Whatever their future held as a couple, Riley Mason deserved to have both his parents in his life. "Of course," she said, carefully transferring the baby to Mason's arms. Mason held his son with the reverence of someone handling the most precious thing in the world. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not just to the baby, but to Victoria. "I'm so sorry for everything." The apology couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but it was a starting point. Victoria had spent months in therapy, working through the trauma of being systematically poisoned, psychologically manipulated, and betrayed by the person she trusted most. She'd learned to separate Mason's weakness and infidelity from Chelsea's calculated evil. One was a failure of character that could potentially be addressed and healed. The other was a fundamental absence of humanity that could never be changed. "We have a lot of work to do," Victoria said softly. "I don't know if we can ever have what we had before, but we can try to build something new." Over the following months, they began the slow process of reconstruction. Victoria moved into a smaller house in Santa Monica, closer to the ocean and further from the memories that haunted their Malibu mansion. Mason took a modest apartment nearby, close enough to be involved in his son's daily life, but far enough to give Victoria the space she needed. They attended couples counseling twice a week, individual therapy sessions, and co-parenting classes. The work was difficult, sometimes painful, but gradually they began to rebuild communication and trust on a foundation of complete honesty. The Victoria who emerged from this process was different from the woman who had been slowly poisoned in her own home. She was stronger, more self-reliant, and absolutely certain of her own worth. She'd started a foundation to help other women who had experienced domestic violence and psychological abuse, using her story to educate people about the subtle signs of manipulation and control. "The thing about psychological abuse," she told audiences at conferences and support groups, "is that it's designed to make you complicit in your own destruction. The abuser doesn't just hurt you, they convince you to hurt yourself." Riley Mason, now 6 months old, was a happy, healthy baby who showed no signs of the trauma he'd experienced in utero. His pediatrician called him a miracle, and Victoria couldn't disagree. Every laugh, every milestone, every moment of ordinary baby joy felt like a victory over the woman who had tried to destroy him before he was born. Mason had thrown himself into fatherhood with the devotion of someone trying to atone for past sins. He changed diapers, gave midnight feedings, and read stories with the dedication of a man who understood that this relationship might be his last chance at redemption. One evening, as they sat together in Victoria's living room, watching their son play on a blanket, Mason asked the question that had been haunting him for months. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? Really forgive me?" Victoria considered the question carefully. Forgiveness, she'd learned in therapy, wasn't something you decided to do once. It was something you chose again and again, day after day. "I think," she said slowly, "that forgiveness is a process, not a destination. I can forgive the man who made terrible choices when he was scared and weak. I'm not sure I can ever forget what those choices cost us." It wasn't the answer Mason had hoped for, but it was honest. And after everything they'd been through, honesty was the most precious gift they could give each other. As the months passed, Victoria began to rebuild her life piece by piece. She returned to work at her charity, which had not only survived her absence but grown stronger under the leadership of the board members who had rallied around her during the crisis. Her story of survival had inspired donors and volunteers, turning her personal tragedy into a force for helping others. The legal system continued to pursue justice for Chelsea's other victims. Based on evidence uncovered during her trial, authorities reopened the investigations into Sarah Morrison's death, Janet Phillips' institutionalization, and Linda Carter's overdose. Chelsea would face additional charges in multiple states, ensuring she would never again have the opportunity to harm another family. A year after Chelsea's conviction, Victoria received a letter from Janet Phillips, who was finally receiving proper treatment for the poisoning that had been misdiagnosed as mental illness. Janet's letter was brief but profound. "Thank you for being strong enough to stop her. My children can finally come home." Victoria framed that letter and hung it in her office. A reminder that survival isn't just personal, it's a responsibility to protect others from the predators who hide behind masks of respectability and charm. The story of Victoria Sterling's poisoning became a cautionary tale studied in psychology courses and law enforcement training programs. It demonstrated how sophisticated psychological manipulation could be, how easily trust could be weaponized, and how important it was to listen to women when they reported feeling unsafe or unwell. But for Victoria herself, the most important lesson was simpler. She had learned to trust her own instincts, to value her own perceptions, and to never again allow anyone to convince her that her reality wasn't valid. As she tucked Riley Mason into his crib one evening, Victoria reflected on how far they'd both come. Her son would grow up in a world where he was safe, loved, and protected. He would never know the fear that had dominated the first months of his existence, and Victoria would continue to grow stronger, using her experience to help other women recognize the signs of manipulation and abuse before it was too late. She'd learned that survival wasn't enough. True healing meant transforming trauma into purpose, pain into power, and personal victory into protection for others. The millionaire had found out the truth, but it hadn't been too late after all. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for the most profound transformations. Victoria Sterling had lost her innocence, her trust, and her perfect life. But she'd gained something more valuable, the absolute certainty of her own strength and the knowledge that she could survive anything. Victoria Sterling's story doesn't end here. Today, she runs one of the largest domestic abuse awareness foundations in California, helping thousands of women recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Her son Riley Mason is now a healthy, happy child who will never know how close he came to never existing. And Chelsea Webb. She's serving life without parole in a maximum security prison, where she will spend the rest of her days thinking about the perfect crime that wasn't perfect enough. This story contains lessons that could literally save your life or the life of someone you love. The signs of psychological manipulation are subtle, but once you know what to look for, they're unmistakable. If this story resonated with you, if it opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, please hit that like button. Your engagement helps YouTube share these important stories with people who might desperately need to hear them. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced someone trying to make you doubt your own reality? What red flags do you think people should watch out for? Your insights might help someone else recognize danger in their own life. And please share this video. You never know who in your social circle might be experiencing something similar and feeling like they're going crazy. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone know they're not alone. If you want more true stories that expose the hidden dangers in our everyday lives, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into cases that matter, stories that could protect you and your loved ones from predators who hide behind perfect smiles and expensive suits. Remember Victoria's most important lesson. Trust your instincts. Your reality is valid, and if something feels wrong, don't let anyone convince you it's all in your head. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you in the next story.